You're tuned in to 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. Today we're examining one of America's most haunting unsolved cases, the 1996 murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. This is a story that feels strangely suspended in time. Though decades have passed since that bleak December morning, the name JonBenét still chills the air in living rooms, on late-night forums, and across countless documentaries and articles. It's a puzzle that begs to be solved, yet stubbornly defies all the usual paths to resolution. On December 26, 1996, Boulder, Colorado woke to find itself at the heart of a national tragedy. Early that morning, Patsy Ramsey picked up the phone in what seemed to be sheer panic, reporting her young daughter missing. A bizarre 2.5-page ransom note claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped. But in a cruel twist, just hours later, JonBenét's father, John, discovered her lifeless body hidden deep within the family's own home. The crime scene was as perplexing as it was disturbing, a lengthy ransom letter left behind, a chaotic household overflowing with friends, clergy, and police officers, and the eerie image of a young pageant star turned victim in the stillness of a holiday morning. What makes this case endure, why it persists as the ultimate true crime enigma, is the sheer improbability of it all. Inside job or cunning intruder, a ransom note that reads like a Hollywood screenplay, conflicting forensic findings, traces of DNA with no clear owner, a grand jury that voted to indict and yet no one was ever charged. And as the years roll by, the mystery grows heavier, not lighter. Today, we'll navigate this tangled web step by step. We'll start with the family, who they were, how they lived, and what led up to that tragic night. Then, we'll follow the evidence, small threads that might point to a killer in the house, or a stranger who slipped in and out unseen. Finally, we'll weigh the theories that have haunted every conversation about this case for nearly 3 decades. By the end of this episode, you may not find peace or a definite answer. Few who dive into this tragedy ever do. But you will come away with a deeper understanding of why JonBenét Ramsey's murder is the endless riddle that continues to captivate and confound us all. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. Before we delve deeper into the events of that fateful night, it's crucial to understand who the Ramseys were. This family, by most accounts, didn't just live comfortably, they lived a life brimming with success, community involvement, and the promise of a bright future. Yet beneath the polished exterior, as some would later speculate, were pressures, insecurities, and complexities that no one could have imagined leading to tragedy. JonBenét Ramsey was a man who had built his life through discipline, ambition, and intelligence. Growing up in Michigan, he earned an engineering degree from Michigan State University and later served as a Navy officer in the Philippines, those years abroad broadening his worldview. By the mid-1990s, he had become the president of Access Graphics, a thriving software distribution company. Under his leadership, Access Graphics reached an impressive milestone, $1 billion in sales. This success positioned John as something of a local celebrity in Boulder's business community. He was no stranger to wealth or the responsibilities that came with it. His friends recall him as kind, thoughtful, and calm under pressure, qualities that would serve him well in business, but would be put to a far more harrowing test in the aftermath of his daughter's murder. Patsy Ramsey, born Patricia Ann Paul, had emerged from West Virginia with a flair for the spotlight. In 1977, she donned the Miss West Virginia crown, a testament to her poised stage presence and commanding personality. Later, she attended West Virginia University, studying journalism, and projected the image of a strong, resilient woman who knew how to charm a crowd. By the time she married John, who was 13 years her senior, Patsy was eager to carry her pageant poise into the role of a devoted wife, mother, and hostess. In Boulder, her southern roots and taste for elegant entertaining stood out amidst the town's more laid-back, bohemian spirit. She filled their 7,000-square-foot Tudor-style home with Christmas cheer each holiday season, decking every room with lavish decor. Friends remember her as vivacious, energetic, and always working on some festive project. However, Patsy's life hadn't been untroubled. She battled stage 4 ovarian cancer earlier in the decade, emerging victorious and grateful, determined to appreciate every moment she had with her family. Together, John and Patsy were a team, or so they appeared to the outside world. Their union produced 2 children, Burke in 1987 and JonBenét in 1990. Burke was described as quiet, reserved, and introspective, often immersed in his video games and gadgets. JonBenét, on the other hand, was effervescent, spirited, friendly, and a natural performer even before the pageants came along. John also had 3 older children, Beth, Melinda, and John Andrew, from his first marriage to Lucinda. Beth's life ended tragically in a car accident years before JonBenét's death, and that loss weighed heavily on John. Melinda and John Andrew were young adults, living out of state. The Ramseys were, by all appearances, a modern blended family who regularly traveled to spend holidays together. In fact, the day JonBenét was reported missing, they were planning to fly to meet John's older children for a second Christmas celebration in Michigan. Life in the Ramsey household, perched on 15th Street in Boulder's upscale neighborhood, was not only comfortable, but often celebratory. They were known to open their doors for Christmas parties, charity events, and social gatherings. Patsy's flair for pageantry translated into her decor, towering Christmas trees in nearly every room, glittering ornaments, and abundant gifts under the tree. Both John and Patsy came from disciplined backgrounds, he, a seasoned businessman and former Navy pilot, she, a pageant queen who battled cancer and won, and yet they seemed determined to embrace life's joys. JonBenét was the sparkle in that household crown. Even at 6, she radiated the kind of confidence and charm that seemed inherited from her mother. She was comfortable on stage, adored dressing up, and sang and danced without self-consciousness. Yet, her parents insisted pageants were just for fun, a weekend pastime. According to family friends, the family's everyday life was not dominated by pageantry. JonBenét and Burke were just typical kids who played, argued, and enjoyed their toys. The difference was that their home was large, their travel plans lavish, and their family name recognized in Boulder's social and business circles. Still, the Ramseys were newcomers to Boulder's culture. Coming from Atlanta, where mink coats and formal soirees weren't unusual, Patsy found Boulder's casual, granola vibe foreign and sometimes uncomfortable. John's company had relocated to Colorado to thrive in the tech environment, and the family had followed, a move that would one day be cited as part of the story's complexity. The Ramseys loved Boulder's scenic beauty, but maintained their more polished, Southern-influenced style. This might have set them apart from neighbors who prided themselves on the city's laid-back charm and outdoorsy ethos. On Christmas Day 1996, the Ramseys' life seemed to be sailing smoothly. John's company had hit that billion-dollar mark. Patsy had recovered from her cancer and was reveling in motherhood. Burke had received the Nintendo 64 he'd longed for, and JonBenét was riding her new green bicycle, just itching to get better at it. That very evening, they visited good friends for dinner, laughed, and exchanged small gifts, envisioning yet another family gathering the next morning as they prepared to fly out early. In those quiet hours before dawn on December 26th, the Ramseys appeared like any successful, happy American family, sleeping comfortably under their own roof, surrounded by love, possessions, and promise. Yet, this was the calm before the storm. What happened that night, and in the hours that followed, would throw the spotlight on every carefully curated detail of their lives. Their wealth, their Southern background, their involvement in pageantry, and their status in the community, everything would be dissected, questioned, and challenged as the world tried to understand how such a terrible crime could befall a family who, just one day before, seemed to have it all. Let's move into a precise hour-by-hour account of what happened from Christmas Day through the early morning hours of December 26th. We'll chart the known activities and the family's movements, as well as the first police actions that morning. This will help us clearly see how a festive holiday turned into a terrible nightmare in just a matter of hours. Afternoon to evening, December 25th, 1996. Afternoon, exact times unknown. After a morning spent opening presents and enjoying a holiday breakfast, the Ramseys spent the afternoon preparing for the trip they intended to take early the next morning. Some last-minute chores included readying luggage, tidying the home, and making sure gifts for extended family were packed or arranged. Late afternoon, approximately 4 p.m. With all immediate holiday gatherings done in their own home, John and Patsy took care of small personal errands. Both children, Burke and JonBenét, were reportedly playing with their new Christmas toys. Early evening, approximately 5 o'clock to 7 p.m., the Ramseys headed out to attend a Christmas dinner at the home of their friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. Burke and JonBenét went along. According to the family's plans, this was a social visit with friends and their children, a final festive note to end Christmas Day. The exact duration of their stay at the White residence is unclear, but the family was present there for several hours, dining, talking, and enjoying the company. Night, December 25th to 26th, 1996. Around 8:30 to 9 p.m., the Ramseys left the White's house, though the exact departure time has varied in different accounts. After leaving, they reportedly made brief stops to drop off gifts to other friends. They had planned to do so before leaving town the next morning. These stops were quick, somewhere between a few minutes to around half an hour in total. Approximately 9 o'clock to 10 p.m., the family arrived back at their own home on 15th Street. Outside, darkness had settled over Boulder, and the Ramseys intended to rise early for a morning flight. Inside their house, Christmas decorations remained aglow. They were, by all accounts, finishing their holiday evening with final preparations for the next day's travels. Before 10:30 p.m., the children were taken upstairs to their bedrooms. JonBenét was reportedly already asleep upon arrival, and she was placed in her own room. Burke was settled into bed as well. John and Patsy concluded their nighttime routine, moving about the home briefly to pack and check items for the upcoming trip. Approximately 10:30 p.m., the entire household was settling in for the night. With an early flight planned, it was understood that everyone would be awake before dawn, so rest was a priority. Early morning hours, December 26, 1996. Approximately 5:25 to 5:30 a.m., Patsy Ramsey rose early, intending to dress and prepare coffee before the scheduled departure to Michigan. She headed downstairs. John Ramsey also woke around this time. Just before 5:52 a.m., as Patsy descended a spiral staircase, she discovered a lengthy handwritten note spread across one of the steps. Reading the first lines, she realized it claimed their daughter had been kidnapped. Overcome with panic, she shouted for John. 5:52 a.m., Patsy made a frantic 911 call from the kitchen phone, reporting her daughter missing and a ransom note on the premises. She ended the call abruptly, before the dispatcher could request she remain on the line. Within minutes of the 911 call, the first police officer, Rick French, arrived at the Ramsey home. John and Patsy informed him of the alarming situation, that JonBenét was gone and a ransom note had been found. Friends of the Ramseys, previously alerted by Patsy's phone calls, began arriving as well. Shortly after 6 a.m. to mid-morning, several more officers and a victim advocate arrived. They performed a cursory look around the house but focused on the idea of a kidnapping. JonBenét's bedroom was sealed off, but the rest of the home was not. Family, friends, clergy, and acquaintances came in and out, attempting to console Patsy and John. 8 o'clock to 10 a.m., the ransom note stated that the kidnappers would call between 8 o'clock and 10 a.m. to arrange the money's delivery. No such call came. During these hours, the Ramseys and their friends waited anxiously. Officers monitored the phone lines, ready to trace any incoming call, but none matching the ransom instructions occurred. Late morning to early afternoon, December 26, 1996. After 10 a.m., with no call from the supposed kidnappers, tension rose. Detectives sought more clarity, but the Ramseys provided few solid leads. Meanwhile, the house remained active with people coming and going, increasing the difficulty of preserving evidence. Around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, the only officer left on scene at this time, asked John Ramsey to search the home again for anything unusual. He and a friend went to the basement, a space that had only been briefly checked before. Shortly after 1 p.m., John opened the door to a small windowless room in the basement, known as the wine cellar. There he discovered JonBenét's body on the floor, covered partly by a blanket. Her death was confirmed, and the nature of the crime scene made it clear this was no simple kidnapping. Following the discovery of JonBenét's body, Detective Arndt called for immediate backup. Additional officers and investigators returned to the house. The crime scene would now be treated as a homicide scene, yet much time and opportunity to preserve evidence had already slipped away. Of all the evidence associated with this case, perhaps nothing has drawn more scrutiny, more debate, and more perplexed head-shaking than the ransom note discovered on the morning of December 26th. It's not just that it exists, it's how very strange it is. Usually, in abductions, ransom notes are short, direct demands, often scrawled hastily. But this note was the exact opposite. It was painstakingly long, oddly specific, and riddled with a tone that was at once threatening, performative, and utterly confounding. Let's begin with its most striking feature, its length. The note spanned 2.5 pages, approximately 370 words, that immediately sets it apart from the norm. Standard kidnappers' demands, especially those allegedly written under tense, time-sensitive conditions, tend to be concise. This letter, however, seemed carefully composed, even rehearsed. It was not only lengthy but also divided into paragraphs in relatively coherent sentences, as if someone took the time to gather their thoughts on the spot. The note's language was both theatrical and inconsistent. The author, claiming to represent a small foreign faction, shifted pronouns in a manner that didn't track logically. They began by referring to themselves as we, supposedly a group, but then switched to I at critical points. Threats against the victim's life were punctuated by oddly personal addresses to John, as if the author knew him, yet their identity remained concealed behind this vague notion of a criminal collective. The author misspelled a few basic words early in the letter, such as business, only to correctly spell more complex words and even use a French-accented attaché later on. This raises the suspicion that the writer attempted to appear less educated or less fluent in English than they truly were. The inconsistencies in style, from halting, uncertain spelling at the start to more confident, even literary phrasing later on, suggest either a deliberate attempt to conceal their normal writing style or a struggle to maintain a fictional persona. The demands were equally peculiar. The specified ransom amount of $118,000 was unnervingly low given the affluent target. Typically, one would expect a higher sum and not an oddly exact figure. Moreover, the instructions provided were strangely detailed, telling the recipient to be well rested and to prepare an adequate-sized attaché for the cash, as if the author were almost concerned for the convenience of the payer. Real kidnappers rarely show such interest in their victims' comfort and logistics, nor do they hand out what reads like etiquette advice for ransom delivery. They also threatened severe punishments in bizarrely vivid ways, including talk of beheading, and cautioned that the victim's family would be under constant scrutiny. Yet for all their supposed vigilance, no calls ever came at the stated time. The note was discovered on paper pulled from inside the residence, written on pages torn out of a notepad that belonged to the household. Its ink came from a pen also found inside the home. The final text was neat enough to suggest that the writer might have practiced. Indeed, a partial practice draft was later found on a separate page in the same tablet. Whoever wrote this was not in a frantic hurry. Instead, they appear to have taken deliberate steps, trying out an opening, discarding it, and then writing the lengthy final version, returning the pad and pen to their places afterward. This level of composure in a supposed high-risk crime is deeply unusual. References within the note also hinted at a familiarity with pop culture. The phrase, "don't try to grow a brain," echoes lines from certain popular films of the time, and the tone borrows from cinematic kidnappings rather than real-life extortion schemes. Why mimic Hollywood if a true kidnapping was taking place? Such stylistic choices could be attempts to mislead investigators, inject random influences, or perhaps reflect the genuine mindset of a killer who was more influenced by movies than actual criminal strategy. When considering the ransom note on its own merits, its length, its stationery and writing utensils sourced from inside the house, its strange combination of poor spelling and sophisticated vocabulary, its oddly personal tone directed at John, its theatrical threats, and the absence of any follow-up call or demand, it emerges as an artifact that raises far more questions than it answers. It's at once the central piece of evidence and one of the greatest stumbling blocks in understanding what truly happened that day. In the world of true crime, a ransom note this elaborate, discovered after the fact, so calmly written and left so conspicuously, is almost unprecedented. It may well be the key to unraveling the mystery, but as the record stands, it's an enigma in plain sight, a bizarre statement that defies conventional logic and continues to stoke debate among investigators, experts, and the public. Several tense hours had dragged by since the early morning call to the police. Inside the Ramsey household, a kind of tense stagnation had set in. Family, friends, clergy, and police had come and gone. No ransom call arrived by the stated deadline. Through it all, only a single detective now remained on site, and the family's anxiety hung in the air. It was around early afternoon, roughly 1 p.m., when Detective Linda Arndt, likely feeling the crush of time and uncertainty, suggested that John Ramsey take another thorough look around the home. The idea was to spot anything out of place, anything that might provide a clue, items that didn't belong, missing valuables, hints as to how someone could have gained entry. The search directive was broad, intended to occupy John and keep him proactive in some manner, and she instructed him to start from the top floor and work downward. The exact reason or strategy for this instruction remains unclear, but the result would be immediate and catastrophic to any remaining sense of hope. Instead of beginning upstairs, John and his friend Fleet White elected to start in the basement. The basement was a warren of rooms and storage areas, some dimly lit and infrequently used. Earlier attempts to search that level had been cursory and complicated by limited lighting and uncertainty about what exactly to look for. Now, with a more focused mission, they moved through the area with deliberate purpose. It was in this subterranean labyrinth that the final, horrifying truth awaited them. The basement included a small, windowless enclosure known as the wine cellar room. Earlier in the day, when friends had peeked in, they found it dark and uninviting, failing to locate a light switch. This time, John went directly to that door. Described as a latched door, unusual in a well-familiar home, its closure might have raised his suspicions. He disengaged the latch, opened the door, and switched on the light. Instantly, something caught his eye. There on the floor, in the stark beam of the basement's low-watt bulb, lay his daughter, JonBenét. She was not hidden behind furniture or tucked into a corner. She lay on her back, as if deliberately placed in that position. Partially covered by a white blanket, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey's body appeared still and silent. According to the accounts given later, the sight was profoundly shocking. John reportedly cried out, calling for help. In that moment, the household's tenuous hope of a kidnapping ransom trade fell apart. JonBenét was not abducted and spirited away. She had never left the home. As John moved closer, he observed duct tape over her mouth. He removed it immediately, an instinctive, desperate gesture of a father who cannot yet fully comprehend what he is seeing. He noted that her arms were raised above her head, and her wrists appeared bound with cord. He attempted to untie these constraints, though the cord's knotting proved too tight. This contact, while understandable as a paternal attempt to help or confirm what he refused to believe, unfortunately disturbed the crime scene, a factor that would later vex investigators. Fleet White, who had been in another part of the basement hallway just moments before, rushed to the room upon hearing John's shout. He witnessed John lifting JonBenét's rigid form and carrying her upstairs. At the top of the steps, chaos reigned anew. Detective Arndt, confronted with the unthinkable, now had to treat the Ramsey residence as a homicide scene, no longer holding out hope for a negotiated release of a living child. She directed John to place JonBenét's body down on the floor. Even at that first glance, the attending personnel could tell she was gone. Rigor mortis had begun its grim work. What had begun in the early morning hours as a supposed kidnapping now revealed itself as a murder committed within the very walls that were believed to shelter and protect the family. Those first moments after the discovery would remain etched in the memories of everyone present. John's heart-wrenching cry, Fleet's alarmed reaction, Arndt's stunned realization that everything they had done that morning to recover JonBenét alive had been tragically in vain. This was the pivot point of the entire case. The tragedy had changed shape. JonBenét was not out there somewhere in the hands of kidnappers. She had never left the premises. This discovery would send shockwaves through the investigation and shift its entire course. The initial assumption of a kidnapping collapsed in a matter of seconds, replaced by the horrifying truth that a brutal crime had taken place under everyone's noses, while officers and friends had walked the halls upstairs. Once JonBenét Ramsey's body was recovered from the basement room, the focus of the investigation shifted to meticulous forensic analysis. The autopsy, performed by Boulder's coroner, and the subsequent examination of forensic evidence would yield critical insights into how and under what conditions this young life ended. Although these findings would not solve the crime outright, they offered essential clues to the nature and sequence of her injuries, the presence of foreign DNA, and the possible tools involved. The medical examination began shortly after JonBenét's body was transported from the residence. The resulting autopsy report concluded that the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In other words, JonBenét had been subjected to strangulation, and she also suffered a severe blow to the head. The head injury was substantial. A skull fracture measuring several inches in length was discovered, running along her skull's right side. This fracture was not visible externally due to the absence of a large laceration, an indication that the force was blunt and possibly administered with a smooth, heavy object. In addition to the head trauma, the report detailed the presence of a nylon cord around her neck. This cord had been tightened using a makeshift garrote fashioned from a broken wooden paintbrush handle. Red marks and abrasions on her neck signified the force applied. The presence of hemorrhages in the delicate tissues around her eyes and neck suggested that at least some aspects of the strangulation occurred while her heart was still beating. The pathologist also identified signs consistent with sexual contact that night. Microscopic examinations indicated injury to the genital area, accompanied by the presence of blood. Another detail noted was what the coroner termed chronic inflammation, implying possible prior irritation or injury, but its interpretation remained contentious. No drugs or alcohol were detected in her bloodstream, and her stomach contained remnants of partially digested food. This helped refine potential timelines but did not provide a definitive time of death. The absence of defensive wounds like scratches on her arms or knuckles left open questions about her level of consciousness or ability to resist. Investigators collected fibers, hairs, and trace materials from JonBenét's body and the blanket draped over her. Black duct tape had covered her mouth, and its adhesive surface captured assorted fibers. A nylon cord was tied not only around her neck, but loosely around one of her wrists. Although her wrists were bound, the binding lacked typical kidnapping restraint patterns, raising questions about whether the cords were cinched before or after death, or placed there as a form of staging. Her clothing yielded important but puzzling findings. Mixed DNA profiles were discovered in her underwear and on her long johns. Some samples appeared to come from multiple unknown contributors. Preliminary tests identified a partial male DNA profile that did not match any family member or known associate at that time. The complexity of these genetic mixtures, combined with the environment of the crime scene, forced investigators to remain cautious about what these discoveries meant. The implement used to fashion the garrote, a broken paintbrush handle, originated from inside the home, as confirmed by the presence of its remaining pieces in an art supply container. The paintbrush's wooden segment had been used to tighten the cord, leaving distinctive marks in the fibers. Microscopic fiber analysis attempted to link certain colored strands on the duct tape and around the ligature sites to possible sources, but without conclusive identification. Additionally, unidentified fibers and debris were found on and beneath the blanket, on the duct tape, and around the body. Some were common household fibers, while others were more unusual. Animal hair and assorted textile fragments raised numerous questions about contamination and transfer, especially given the number of people who had entered the house after the initial discovery. Taken as a whole, the autopsy and forensic findings portrayed a violent homicide executed with cruel precision. Despite the wealth of microscopic detail, fibers, hair strands, DNA fragments, material from the garrote, and evidence of blunt force trauma and strangulation, no single piece of this forensic puzzle emerged as a definitive roadmap to the killer's identity. Without independent eyewitnesses or a clear murder weapon conclusively identified, the forensic evidence offered tantalizing but incomplete clues. Unknown male DNA, complex mixtures of genetic material on the victim's clothing, carefully chosen ligatures from within the home, and injuries suggestive of a staged crime scene, all these details formed a complicated tapestry. They underscored the careful, deliberate nature of the act, yet stubbornly resisted providing a simple answer to the question of who committed it. The autopsy and forensic report stand as crucial cornerstones of this mysterious case, illuminating aspects of the crime's brutality and complexity, yet leaving investigators grappling with the limits of scientific certainty in the face of human deceit. In high-profile cases, investigators rely not only on physical evidence but also on the consistency and credibility of witness accounts, especially from those closest to the victim. In the Ramsey case, numerous subtle discrepancies and unusual decisions emerged from the very start. These contradictions in the family's sometimes puzzling behavior would plant seeds of doubt, not just in the minds of investigators, but in the public at large. One recurring issue was the variation in how certain events of the previous night and early morning were described. For example, initial discussions suggested one scenario, that JonBenét had remained asleep from the time they arrived home until the moment she was discovered missing. Yet in earlier remarks made on the morning of December 26th, there were hints that the child might have been awake, such as a statement that reading to the children occurred, or that someone might have interacted with JonBenét before she was put to bed. Over time, these initial spontaneous comments seemed to vanish, replaced by a more uniform narrative that JonBenét was asleep the entire time. To investigators, this shift was not definitive proof of wrongdoing, but it was certainly odd. Why would parents recollect details differently in the immediate aftermath, then firmly settle on a simpler narrative later? Equally curious was the confusion around the ransom note. Patsy Ramsey initially indicated she read only the first few lines before sprinting upstairs to check JonBenét's bedroom. Yet on the 911 call, she referenced details from deeper in the letter, including the unusual signature line. Later, pressed on this point, Patsy seemed uncertain or vague about how much of the note she actually absorbed before contacting the authorities. It's easy to imagine a distraught parent mixing up small details. Still, these inconsistencies gave investigators pause. The ransom note had been so central and so bizarre, one would expect its discovery to be burned into a mother's mind, leaving less room for confusion. There were also conflicting accounts related to Burke's activity. Initially, family members implied that Burke slept through the entire ordeal of the early morning hours. Later, it emerged that Burke may have been awake before the police arrived, or at least alert enough to overhear commotion. Such confusion could be explained by panic and grief, but investigators questioned whether these evolving accounts served a strategic purpose, shifting as the parents came to understand which details might draw unwanted attention. Another pattern that raised suspicion was the manner in which the Ramseys, despite professing shock and horror, took certain steps that seemed more aligned with damage control than a desperate hunt for their daughter's kidnapper. They retained high-powered attorneys exceptionally early, not just for themselves but also extended to family members who weren't even in Boulder at the time. They also brought in a public relations consultant right away. While seeking counsel is a constitutional right and often a wise move, it didn't sit well with police that the parents of a brutally murdered child seemed, from their perspective, more tightly managed than candid, more guarded than relentlessly cooperative. Some officials wondered, did they worry they'd be seen as suspects, or did they know something that required a legal fortress? Then came the presence of friends, religious figures, and well-wishers who gathered in the home's kitchen and hallways, moving freely about the scene. This was unusual under the best of circumstances. By calling friends over almost immediately, before police instructions or professional guidance, the family inadvertently facilitated a chaotic environment. The swarm of visitors made it all but impossible for officers to maintain a pristine crime scene. Although this could reflect just a panicked family seeking comfort, to detectives it signaled a lack of priority on preserving potential evidence. It's a small detail, but in a case where every minor action is scrutinized, it was noted as suspicious. Media appearances also raised eyebrows. The Ramseys granted a television interview days after the murder, before submitting to formal, structured police interviews. This perplexed those tasked with solving the crime. While some might argue that addressing the public could help generate leads, investigators felt stymied. Why spend time appealing to the masses instead of thoroughly assisting the authorities who were working the case? None of these conflicting accounts or questionable behaviors alone prove wrongdoing. Families in crisis can easily become confused, traumatized individuals might forget details, and the shock of losing a child is unimaginable. Yet, in a murder investigation, precision and consistency are essential. Every shift in narrative, every half-remembered timeline, every unorthodox decision can undermine credibility. For the detectives, these discrepancies and seemingly suspicious choices were a signal. There were layers of complexity here. Whether they pointed to deliberate deception or simply trauma-induced chaos remained to be discovered. But one thing was certain, this family's statements and actions would be closely examined and re-examined for any subtle hint that could crack the case wide open. After countless hours of investigation, analysis, and public debate, the case of JonBenét Ramsey has given rise to three broad categories of theories. These overarching frameworks don't rest on a single detail or piece of evidence. Rather, they reflect how people arrange all the known facts and contradictions into a narrative that makes sense to them. Each theory has its own internal logic, as well as persistent shortcomings that prevent it from becoming universally accepted. 1. The family's involvement, RDI. One prevailing line of thought contends that one or both of JonBenét's parents had a hand in her death, or at least in covering it up. This perspective, often summarized as, Ramseys did it, RDI, arose in part because the crime happened under their own roof and at a time when outsiders seemingly would have had limited opportunity. Adherents of this theory interpret various confusing aspects of the case as signs of family staging, misdirection, or withheld truths. The central appeal of RDI is its simplicity. Historically, crimes against children often involve someone in their household. Supporters argue that if one views every strange occurrence through the lens of a cover-up, much of the baffling complexity might be explained. Still, the RDI theory struggles to definitively identify which family member might be responsible, or why they would have chosen such a convoluted route. While it offers a sense of Occam's razor that the killer was no stranger, it must contend with the reality that no clear confession or conclusive match to the crime emerged from within the family unit. 2. The sibling hypothesis, BDI. A more specific subset of family involvement theories focuses on the older brother Burke. Proponents of the Burke did it, BDI scenario often present it as a tragic accident or impulsive act rather than a calculated crime. For them, the complicated aftermath could stem from parental protection, desperate attempts by the adults in the home to shield the surviving child from legal consequences or public condemnation. Those who subscribe to this theory find it compelling due to its explanatory power. It posits that an unexpected juvenile misdeed cascaded into panic-driven decisions by adults. They see the confusing and contradictory events that followed as parental efforts to preserve their remaining family. Critics of BDI note that this theory often relies heavily on interpreting subtle behaviors and psychological assumptions rather than direct, incontrovertible evidence. Nonetheless, it remains a popular line of reasoning for those who believe no adult would intentionally harm a child they so publicly cherished, yet cannot shake the suspicion that the tragedy did not originate from outside. 3. The unknown intruder, IDI. At the opposite end of the spectrum lies the intruder did it, IDI, theory, which insists that the crime was perpetrated by someone entirely outside the family circle. Followers of the ED school of thought lean on the notion that such a bizarre and cruel act might be best explained by an external predator, a criminal with either a targeted motive or a sadistic, opportunistic agenda. They argue that, sometimes, improbable crimes do occur in seemingly safe communities, and the complexity of this case may be due to a cunning offender's ability to confound investigators. The ED perspective appeals to those who trust that random and brutal acts can, and do, happen in even the most improbable settings. Yet it must grapple with the statistical rarity of such a scenario and explain how a stranger could execute such a heinous act undetected and leave so few definitive traces linking them to the crime scene. The ongoing divide. These three main theories, RDI, BDI, and ED, represent not just sets of beliefs but entire frameworks into which individuals plug in each inconsistency, each baffling clue, each behavioral oddity. The result is a heated and ongoing debate. No matter which theory you find more plausible, it's easy to spot holes and unanswerable questions in the others. Over the years, each perspective has gained ardent supporters who believe their chosen lens provides the best fit for the puzzle, and vehement critics who can list numerous reasons why that same viewpoint falls short. Today, these three schools of thought remain at the center of conversations about the case. They don't solve the crime themselves, but they do help structure the chaos, giving shape to the countless facts and contradictions. Whether one suspects a family cover-up, a sibling's panicked mistake, or an intruder's twisted plan, everyone who studies this mystery confronts the same problem. No theory explains it all without leaving some crucial questions unanswered. By the late 1990s, with the homicide still unsolved and public pressure mounting, officials in Boulder took a significant step, convening a grand jury to evaluate the case. A grand jury, unlike a trial jury, does not determine guilt, but rather decides if sufficient probable cause exists to charge a suspect and move forward to a criminal trial. It is a secretive process, generally led by prosecutors presenting a streamlined version of the evidence they have gathered. In this instance, the Boulder grand jury was impaneled in September 1998 and met over the following months, hearing testimony, reviewing documents, and looking at physical evidence. These 12 jurors had the unique authority to assess the situation independently, away from media scrutiny. They were given the time and space to consider whether anyone connected to the case should be formally accused and brought before a criminal court. It was a complex case with a voluminous amount of information, thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and forensic details, along with legal arguments from both sides. The proceedings were kept under tight wraps. Neither the public nor the press knew exactly what evidence was presented. Colorado law enforces secrecy around grand jury deliberations, so while observers knew that the grand jury was working, they had little idea what conclusions were being formed. Prosecutors, too, were remarkably closed-lipped. The hope from those who wanted justice was that this grand jury, composed of ordinary Boulder citizens, would cut through the confusion and either clear the Ramseys definitively or find grounds to charge them or another suspect. In October 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter emerged to make a long-awaited announcement: no charges would be filed. On its surface, the message suggested that the grand jury had not found probable cause to indict. For years, many believed the grand jury had simply decided not to move forward, an outcome that left the public perplexed but not necessarily shocked, given the complexity of the case. Then, in a dramatic twist nearly 14 years later, court documents were released in 2013 showing that the grand jury actually had voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey. They recommended charging the parents not with murder, but rather with lesser offenses related to putting their child in a situation that led to her death and aiding or abetting an unknown individual who had committed the murder. This was a startling revelation. The jurors' decision meant that, in their estimation, there was enough evidence to at least try the Ramseys for those related offenses. So why no indictment back in 1999? At the time, Alex Hunter stated that he would not sign the indictment because he did not believe the evidence reached the prosecutorial standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. A grand jury's probable cause standard is lower, and a DA can still refuse to bring charges if they personally believe the case is too weak to secure a conviction. Hunter exercised that discretion. This disconnect created considerable controversy. For over a decade, the public assumed that the grand jury had chosen not to indict, when in truth they had. The DA's refusal to proceed, a rare event, led to intense debate among legal analysts, the media, and the community. Some praised Hunter's caution, arguing it spared Boulder a costly and doomed trial. Others criticized what they saw as a betrayal of the jurors' work and the public's right to a more transparent process. The belated exposure of the grand jury's decision to indict changed the lens through which the case was viewed. It cast fresh suspicion on the official narrative and led many to question whether the district attorney's office had been too influenced by external factors, politics, public pressure, legal counsel, or perhaps convinced that they simply could not win at trial. In the end, the grand jury's recommendation and the DA's refusal to act left a legal limbo in place. No one would face charges stemming from this murder through that route. The world was left to contemplate a puzzling reality. A grand jury saw enough evidence for at least a trial on related charges, yet the final gatekeeper of prosecution chose to keep the doors closed. One hallmark of this case, setting it apart from countless other crimes, is the peculiar texture of its written communications, chiefly the Ransom Note. Beyond the simple content of its demands, investigators and observers have struggled to reconcile the note's linguistic oddities, handwriting patterns, and subtle cultural cues that might reveal something about the author's identity and motives. Handwriting as a clue. Early on, experts dissected the curves, slants, letter formations, and spacing of the Ransom Note's handwriting. Graphologists and forensic document examiners scrutinized each pen stroke, hoping that style and form would uncover the writer's age, gender, dominant hand, or educational level. While handwriting analysis can sometimes exclude suspects, it is rarely definitive enough to name a single individual as its author. Instead, handwriting served as a source of endless debate, the letter T being crossed in a certain way, or the formed with a particular loop, all offered hints but no conclusive truths. The complexity arose in part from the note's evident shifts in style. The first few lines contain simple spelling mistakes, which abruptly vanish as the note progresses. Could this indicate an attempt to appear uneducated or foreign? Was the writer nervous at first and then gained confidence, settling into their true writing style? Without overlapping forensic evidence tying handwriting patterns to a known person, the analysis hit a wall. Still, it remains one of the central arenas for argument among those fascinated by the case, some convinced they see a known suspect's penmanship behind the lines, others concluding nothing can be proven. Linguistic and literary influences. The vocabulary and tone of the Ransom Note seemed uncommonly verbose. Kidnappers typically demand money and instruct that no cops be called, leaving it at that. Here, the author issued a lengthy set of instructions, peppered with dramatic threats and odd reassurances. Words like attaché, with an accent no less, and phrases like don't try to grow a brain sound more like they stepped out of a movie script or a pulp novel than a hardened criminal's frantic scribble. This cinematic flavor didn't go unnoticed. Observers pointed to possible references borrowed from popular films. Certain lines echo threatening dialogue heard in big-screen kidnappings. The level of detail, advising the recipient to be rested and giving a specific, odd amount of money, reinforced the impression of someone consciously playing a role. It's as if the author had absorbed cultural templates of ransom notes from Hollywood thrillers and tried to reenact them on paper, failing to produce the authentic simplicity of a real criminal demand. Cultural context and perception. The presence of potentially foreign-sounding elements and the self-description as a small foreign faction injected a layer of cultural misdirection. America in the mid-1990s remained wary of international terrorism, having witnessed various high-profile incidents in preceding years. Was the author deliberately evoking global intrigue, or was it a clumsy attempt to shift suspicion outward? The language chosen, respecting the business but not the country it serves, signing off with mysterious initials, hinted that the writer wanted to conjure an exotic, shadowy figure that belonged to some unnamed militant group. Yet analysts wondered, would a genuine foreign faction detail their motivations in such a strange, half-baked manner? Beyond the letter itself, the case's cultural references seeped into public discourse. The media and public combed through each unusual phrase, wondering if it might be an inside joke or tied to a specific set of films or books. The act of writing a lengthy ransom note in the home of an affluent family, for example, raised speculation that the author may have identified with wealth, power, and prestige, or conversely resented it. The note's odd respect for the victim's father's business, but not his country, plays into cultural tensions and class commentary that are never fully explained. Limitations of language as evidence. For all the focus on handwriting and word choices, these elements remained inherently limited. Language can be imitated, movie references can be forced, and careful criminals can mimic or abandon their natural style at will. Yet the letter remains central because it is one of the few direct communications from the unknown killer, or at least someone intimately involved. Its cultural echoes and unusual phrases have been endlessly reinterpreted over time. Some argue that over-analysis of the note's style and references might lead down endless rabbit holes, spotting patterns where none exist, or overvaluing a turn of phrase that might have been chosen at random. Still, others maintain that understanding these linguistic nuances is key, believing that somewhere in its 2.5 pages lies a clue that could finally name its author. A lingering lingual legacy. In the years since the crime, the Ransom Note's language, handwriting, and cultural callbacks have cemented themselves as a piece of infamous criminal folklore. They serve as a reminder that in certain cases, words can deepen a mystery rather than clarify it. The note's style is integral to why this case remains so memorable. It's a literary artifact that simultaneously feels too contrived to be real and too specific to be pure fiction. As such, it continues to attract new waves of linguistic experts, cultural critics, and amateur sleuths seeking meaning between every line and curve of the pen. Even in an era already accustomed to high-profile true crime stories, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey struck a nerve. Almost immediately after the news broke, it became a sensation, occupying prime slots on national newscasts, dominating tabloid covers, and fueling endless panels of experts on talk shows. This wasn't just a regional tragedy, it was a media phenomenon that swept across the country and eventually, far beyond its borders. What set this case apart in the public arena? For one, the victim's image was unforgettable. The photographs and pageant footage of JonBenét, big smiles, elaborate costumes, posed dances, offered the media a ready-made hook, a visual narrative they could replay repeatedly. The camera-friendly aura surrounding this young girl contrasted jarringly with the brutal reality of her death. Viewers were exposed to a haunting dichotomy, the fantasy world of child pageants on one side, and a grisly crime scene on the other. Sensational newspapers and television segments seized on that contrast. Her polished appearance in pageant clips, intended as harmless talent displays, was recast by some outlets in a far darker light, questioning the nature of such competitions and, by extension, the parenting that allowed them. Public fascination surged into what can best be described as a collective obsession. Rumors, many unverified, turned into front-page stories. Early police missteps, complex family dynamics, and the strange circumstances of the crime all provided fertile ground for speculation. Without official clarity, the public hungrily consumed a mixture of fact, guesswork, and outright fantasy. Talk shows lined up guests who could comment on body language, lifestyle, and subtle behaviors. Magazine articles and tabloid TV special reports presented conflicting narratives nightly. The willingness of some outlets to run with sensational claims, sometimes based on partial leaks or second-hand whispers, quickly turned media coverage from investigative reporting into a kind of circus. The family found itself scrutinized not only for possible involvement, but for how they grieved, how they responded to questioning, what they wore, and how they spoke on camera. Every gesture, tear, or lack thereof, was dissected under an unforgiving public microscope. The result, a messy collision of public opinion, often detached from the methodical standards of a legal investigation. It wasn't just traditional media either. Even in the mid-1990s, early internet forums began hosting discussions about the Ramsey case. These virtual communities allowed anyone with a theory to share it widely. Speculation soared, and the case became one of the early examples of how the web could amplify amateur sleuthing. This development would later become typical in true crime cases, but at the time it was relatively new, fanning the flames of public interest well beyond typical daily news cycles. Public perception was deeply divided. Some found themselves sympathetic to the grieving family, outraged at the media's insinuations. Others saw the lack of clarity and the affluent, public-facing family's decisions as suspicious. Professional commentators weighed in with psychological profiles, while strangers on the street debated guilt or innocence as if the trial had already occurred. Over time, many people found themselves fatigued, frustrated by the endless swirl of breaking developments that often led nowhere. Yet the interest never truly vanished. It simmered, flaring up again with each new anniversary, each documentary promise of new revelations. This intense, ongoing coverage took its toll on everyone involved. The Boulder community faced unwanted spotlight, with its local police and authorities cast as either heroes or hapless bystanders, depending on which media voice one believed. The broader public struggled to separate reliable information from sensationalized half-truths. And JonBenét, once just a beloved daughter and sister, had become a symbol, her name synonymous with a media ecosystem that sometimes appeared to value narrative drama over verified fact. In the long run, the media frenzy around JonBenét's murder changed how high-profile cases would be covered. It highlighted the dangers of rushing to judgment or relying on insinuation over evidence. It also showed how public perception can be molded by the angles and images news outlets choose to broadcast repeatedly. Above all, it set the stage for the Ramsey case to persist not only as an unsolved crime, but as a cultural touchstone for media-driven mystery, guaranteeing that public perception would remain as conflicted and tangled as the case itself. In any major homicide case, the handling of the earliest investigative steps can be as crucial as the forensic evidence itself. From the very first hours, the inquiry into JonBenét Ramsey's murder was marred by procedural lapses, interagency tensions, and a perceived lack of a unified strategy. Over the following months and years, these issues would bloom into full-fledged controversies. Observers, both professional and public, questioned why a case that seemed, at first glance, to be solvable had spiraled into a labyrinth of doubt. One significant point of contention centered on jurisdictional frictions. In Boulder, the local police department, accustomed more to property crimes and misdemeanors than to intricate homicides, suddenly found itself under the lens of a scrutinizing public and intense media coverage. The Boulder Police Department did not have a dedicated homicide division at the time, and their unfamiliarity with the complexity of a child murder case became a focus of criticism. Those who examined the process later argued that standard protocols for major crimes were inconsistently applied or delayed. The resulting perception was that crucial opportunities for collecting and preserving key evidence or securing decisive leads slipped away. Compounding this problem was a noticeable strain between the Boulder Police and the District Attorney's Office. Their relationship, central to guiding an investigation and eventually deciding on prosecution, became fraught with disagreements. While the police labored under the assumption that the solution lay in thorough interrogation and tight investigative control, the district attorney's office sometimes appeared cautious, reluctant, or even resistant to certain approaches. This tension was never expressed through official press conferences explicitly naming the conflict, but it seeped into the investigative momentum, creating a scenario where strategic decisions were slow and hesitant. Some insiders would later claim that promising avenues of inquiry were never fully explored, and leads that might have benefited from rapid specialized input were allowed to languish as various departments struggled to align their efforts. Outside expertise became another source of controversy. In high-profile, complicated cases, it is not uncommon to bring in seasoned homicide detectives, FBI advisors, or state-level investigative teams. While some external consultants were eventually enlisted, the timing and scope of their involvement were questioned. Critics argue that if more experienced detectives or independent forensic analysts had entered the case from the start, critical mistakes might have been avoided. Instead, the investigative timeline featured delays, withdrawals, and reassignments that eroded confidence in the operation's cohesion. Also standing out were the investigative priorities, which often appeared uncertain from the outside. The public, watching with growing impatience, saw shifting narratives, partial leaks of information hinting at one theory or another, and periods of near silence. These fluctuations created an impression of disorganization. Former officials familiar with best practices noted that the information flow often seemed inconsistent. Observers wondered whether a more structured command hierarchy could have prevented key misunderstandings between officers, prosecutors, and consultants. If a single authoritative figure or unit had taken charge decisively, maybe the case would have avoided the mire of confusion it later became famous for. In addition, there were questions about why certain leads weren't pursued with more vigor or why others received disproportionate attention without producing results. Some claimed personal biases or fixation on certain aspects of the case caused investigators to discount or postpone examining potentially relevant material. The resulting gaps fueled endless speculation that personal or political considerations had seeped into what should have been a straightforward, all-hands-on-deck murder investigation. All these issues, large and small, chipped away at public trust. Over time, the impression that emerged was one of a fractured investigative environment. Instead of a smooth synergy between detectives, prosecutors, and external experts, the operation felt like it was pulling in competing directions. Documents and official statements released or leaked years afterward hinted at internal disagreements about the strength of evidence, the meaning of certain findings, and the tactical steps needed to pressure suspects or confirm leads. In sum, while other notorious cases have faced public dissatisfaction, the Ramsey murder inquiry became a study in how early missteps, conflicting approaches, and contested decision-making can impede progress on even the most scrutinized crimes. These controversies lingered over the case like a persistent shadow, one reason why, despite massive attention and resources, it slipped into a state of enduring uncertainty. As years passed and the conventional leads grew cold, hope for a breakthrough in the JonBenét Ramsey case began to rest increasingly on scientific progress. Forensic methodologies continuously evolve, and techniques once considered cutting-edge can become obsolete in a matter of years. In a world where once impenetrable cold cases are being solved by newly refined DNA analysis and genealogical databases, it is no surprise that investigators, the public, and even the victim's family have looked toward technological leaps as a potential key. In the late 1990s, DNA testing on small or degraded samples was limited by sensitivity thresholds. Only robust, non-contaminated DNA could yield conclusive profiles. At that time, the complexity of the Ramsey case's genetic mixtures, tiny partial profiles commingled with the victim's own DNA, offered little clarity. But by the mid to late 2000s, advances in touch DNA technology emerged. Touch DNA could generate profiles from the faintest cellular residues left by skin contact. Suddenly, items that once held no promise for additional leads could be re-examined at a microscopic scale. This advance didn't immediately solve the case, but it raised expectations that previously inconclusive samples might one day yield more definitive results. Beyond touch DNA, sophisticated computational tools have come into play. Previously, analysts might discard mixed or partial profiles as inconclusive. Modern software can deconvolute mixed samples more accurately, separating out individual contributors to a degree that was not possible during the early investigation. This means that small fragments of DNA found on clothing or ligature materials could, in theory, be teased apart to identify a clearer profile of the perpetrator. Yet another leap lies in advanced sequencing methods, often called next-generation sequencing, NGS. Unlike traditional forensic testing, which compares limited markers, NGS examines entire genomic regions. This can offer a more comprehensive look at genetic material, potentially narrowing down ancestry or phenotypic traits of the unknown contributor. The idea that advanced sequencing could provide even the slimmest lead, like whether the suspect has certain identifiable genetic markers, has led many to advocate for retesting key evidence with the latest scientific protocols. Perhaps the most talked about development in forensic science, however, is the use of genealogical databases. High-profile arrests in other cold cases, where unidentified DNA profiles were linked to distant relatives through public genealogy sites, sparked a surge of interest. Advocates argue that, if the Ramsey evidence can be processed in a format compatible with genetic genealogy research, the killer's family tree might be mapped out. Even if the killer never submitted their DNA to a public database, a third or fourth cousin might have, allowing investigators to build indirect leads. But there have been hurdles. Questions linger about the quantity and condition of the original samples. Technology's leaps forward are remarkable, but they rely on preserved, uncontaminated evidence. Handling errors or degradation over decades can limit the success of new tests. Additionally, the legal and procedural framework for genealogical searches can be complex, sometimes requiring cooperation from the authorities who hold the evidence. There is also the matter of jurisdiction and willingness. Will the local agencies agree to hand over materials to advanced private labs known for pushing the envelope in cold case work? Over time, pleas have come from multiple corners, experts urging that new tests be tried, independent laboratories offering their cutting-edge techniques, and even members of the public and victims' family calling on officials to embrace whatever scientific edge they can find. The constant refrain is that DNA technology has changed drastically since 1996, and each year brings more refined tools and methods. While no official new round of testing has conclusively solved the case, discussions about applying state-of-the-art methods, whether that be enhanced touch DNA analysis, NGS, or genealogical tracking, continue to simmer. Occasional public statements hint at ongoing evaluations of these options, raising hopes that the passage of time, paradoxically, might be what finally leads to the truth. In the broader landscape of forensic science, the Ramsey case remains a prime candidate for re-examination. It exemplifies a scenario where the original testing was insufficient to identify a perpetrator, but not wholly useless, a scenario where incremental improvements in technology, coupled with databases that did not exist 2 decades ago, could tip the scales. While such attempts have yet to revolutionize this particular investigation, the promise of new testing lingers, like a distant beacon, reminding everyone that the story isn't necessarily over as long as science keeps advancing. As time passes, certain crimes transcend their original investigations, becoming a permanent fixture in cultural memory. The case at hand, so perplexing and unresolved, now belongs to that small category of watershed moments that shape how we view justice, how the media reports tragedy, and how the public engages with true crime. One key aspect of the legacy is how it prompted a reevaluation of media ethics and standards. The unprecedented saturation coverage, combined with the public's insatiable curiosity, led to endless cycles of speculation and commentary. Years later, journalists and producers would look back on this event as a cautionary tale. Running sensational headlines without rigorous fact-checking or relying heavily on rumor and innuendo could distort understanding rather than bring clarity. In the wake of this case, major news outlets and even entertainment programs reconsidered their approaches to reporting on ongoing investigations, some gradually embracing a more measured tone, at least in theory. This case also signaled an early prototype of the modern true crime frenzy. Before the advent of widespread social media and the proliferation of podcasts and streaming docuseries, it offered the public a template for immersive amateur investigation. Viewers and readers weren't just passive consumers, they became active participants, forming discussion groups, trading theories, and devouring every new tidbit of information. In hindsight, this evolving participatory culture can be traced in part to the fervor sparked here. The lasting result is a climate where true crime content doesn't just inform the public, it engages them, tapping into their own investigative instincts. This shift endures, with countless contemporary cases followed by communities of armchair detectives who see themselves as contributors to the search for truth. On an institutional level, the case's legacy resonates with the criminal justice system's awareness of public opinion. Observers noted how intensely public sentiment could mount pressure on authorities. This set a precedent. Officials realized that managing public expectations was crucial. Even as investigators kept their silence on certain leads or declined to bring charges, they now understood that every such decision would be dissected for decades. Contemporary prosecutors and detectives often cite the lessons gleaned from this environment, balancing transparency with the need to protect the integrity of ongoing inquiries. Forensic science and technological methods also figure into the case's legacy. While the original investigation may have struggled with certain techniques or interpretations, the knowledge that future breakthroughs might eventually unravel the mystery has kept hope alive. In this sense, the case became a symbol of how evidence, preserved and revisited with emerging methodologies, might someday crack the seemingly uncrackable. Modern investigators and reform-minded policymakers view it as a reason to maintain and catalog old evidence meticulously, preserving it for reanalysis when enhanced procedures become available. Culturally, the very name of the victim now stands as a shorthand for an enduring enigma, a reminder that some questions outlast the generation that first asked them. Over the decades, references to this case have appeared in art, literature, classroom discussions of media ethics, and even casual conversation as a byword for complexity. The enduring narrative, frequently reshaped by new documentaries or anniversary retrospectives, has transcended geographic and temporal boundaries, lodging itself into the collective psyche. Its persistent presence demonstrates that a single tragic story can leave a mark far beyond the immediate community or time period, influencing how future cases are interpreted by both professionals and the public at large. Ultimately, this case's legacy is multifaceted. It stands as a memorial to a life ended too soon, a catalyst for change in media reporting and public engagement with unsolved crimes, an impetus for improved investigative rigor, and a perennial prompt for reflection on how society craves, processes, and sometimes exploits the mysteries it cannot solve. As the years turn into decades, what remains is a complex inheritance, both a caution and a reminder that mysteries, once unleashed into the cultural sphere, can continue to evolve and educate long after the last official report has been filed. In the final tally, what defines this case is not simply that it has gone unsolved, but the manner in which it defies any neat resolution. We have a crime committed under extraordinary circumstances, evidence that hints at multiple paths yet conclusively proves none, and a narrative that has fractured into a prism of competing interpretations. The story of JonBenét Ramsey's murder has never settled into a stable form. Instead, it shifts with each retelling, each new piece of technology, and each re-examination by fresh eyes. If this journey has revealed one certainty, it's the endurance of mystery. We've explored broad theories, family involvement, a sibling's tragic misdeed, or a cunning intruder, none of them fitting perfectly. We've encountered a ransom note too elaborate to make sense, forensic evidence both illuminating and confusing, and investigative efforts stumbling under internal tensions and immense media spotlight. All these aspects ensure the case lingers on in the public imagination, refusing to fade into a historical footnote. The continuing fascination isn't just morbid curiosity, it's driven by a deep human need for answers and justice. The struggle to understand what happened that Christmas night long ago has shaped how countless people think about evidence, innocence, and moral certainty. It stands as a stark reminder that even with modern investigative tools, an extensive media infrastructure, and an army of professional and amateur sleuths, closure can remain elusive. This is a truth that humbles those who believe every crime can be solved if we simply try hard enough. Yet the absence of definitive answers does not equate to a complete absence of meaning. The effort to piece together the puzzle reveals the fragility of investigative systems under intense scrutiny, the pitfalls of conjecture overwhelming solid proof, and the ways a single crime can spur discussions and reforms in policing, forensic science, and journalism ethics. The legacy left behind is complicated, painful for a grieving family, and frustrating for a world used to demanding solutions. As we close this examination, we are left contemplating the core tragedy, a 6-year-old who did not see another new year, her future stolen, and her memory now forever tied to an unending debate. The value in revisiting this case may lie not just in the hope of someday identifying a culprit, but in understanding how easily the quest for truth can be derailed by confusion, fear, and the passage of time. Ultimately, JonBenét Ramsey's murder endures as a quiet, persistent question. Who did this? Why? Without fresh evidence or a confession, the best we have are lessons learned and a collective vigil of memory and inquiry. For now, the final chapter remains unwritten. And that, perhaps, is the case's most haunting legacy, an echo of uncertainty resonating through the years, reminding us that not all stories find their ending. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've made it to this point, drop a comment with the word "done," and we'll give you a personal shout-out to show our appreciation. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive in this murder and media frenzy. It was as fascinating for us to create as we hope it was for you to hear. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where you can get early access to our content, have your questions answered directly, and enjoy exclusive members-only content. We'd love to know what you think about this case. Was justice truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below, We're always eager to hear your thoughts. For those wanting to explore more on true crime, we've included Amazon affiliate links to some of the books we referenced in our researches. Purchasing through the link won't cost you anything extra, but it will support the channel and help us continue bringing you more content. If you're craving even more, consider joining our Patreon community. As a member, you'll get access to the full script of this episode, exclusive book summaries, and even the complete set of images featured in this case, available for purchase in our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.